again to another in the lovely series we call It's All About Writing by the Dark Oak Press team. Tonight's topic is about world building, and I know a lot of people go immediately in their brain and world building to fantasy worlds and stuff like that, but world building is so much more, and in so many different genres. So we're excited that everyone came tonight and they're interested in the topic. And for those that are joining us on our YouTube channel, we're glad you're back to listen to us. Please subscribe, please share, tell your friends about it. The more views we get, the better we are, and the more we can have these events to share. So tonight, I'd like to introduce, I'm Pat Sawtelle, and I'm a Dark Oak Press writer, and I'd like to introduce my cohort here for the night.
I am Wes Yahola. I am also a Dark Oak Press writer. My book is The Artifice Conspiracy, which has its own world, which is what we're here talking about tonight.
Yes, lots of world.
Yes.
Yes.
Did you want to go?
Yeah, let me go. So, and this is my book. This is the first in a series. It's called Chalice Princess Series, and Chalice Moon is the first book. And so let's just dive into what is a world. The thing that everybody has to remember is a world is the basics. It's, you know, who you are, who the people are, the world that they live in includes their beliefs, their clothing, their transportation, the vegetation, everything. And some people like to take that straight to fantasy, but even your mystery books, that little mystery book you love to read that's set in a small town or all around a chocolate store or in the seaside village, even things like
Mitford.
Go ahead.
The Mitford series.
The Mitford series, that's right. So it doesn't matter. Everything is a world because you're creating what that reality is. Where's the store? Where's the house? What color is it? What color is the couch? You're creating those worlds, and you have to make them believable. And it doesn't matter if it's a short story or a novel. You still have a world. You still have characters, people, things that constrain them. Superheroes in comic books, they have constraints in their worlds. Even Superman has a problem. I mean, Kryptonite's a problem. So we're going to jump into it and let Wes kind of get me started on why did you get into world building and what do you like about it?
I got into world building because every story has to take place somewhere, and the world building is the where it takes place. And when I approach it, I've approached world building on different occasions for very different things. I approached it in my younger years because I played Dungeons and Dragons and needed a place for the adventures to happen. That was a case of world building from the big size down, where you're taking an entire setting where lots of things are going to happen. You don't necessarily know what they all are, and you build from the big down to the bottom. You start with coastlines and rivers and plains and bio areas, and then get into the cultures and set up points of interest and set up for the adventures. Most storytelling and writing is probably not going to start that way, though. You're going to want the world to serve the story, and that's how I approached it when I was doing Artifice Conspiracy and its coming sequels. Is I had the story that I wanted to tell and developed the characters and some of the pointed events and started to build a world around them. If I want the characters to travel, they need points to travel to and reasons to travel, and they need to know how the roads are, how the cultures are that they're going to go see, how the people are that they interact with directly. So those are all things that have to be considered. That's getting the bones of what you want for the story and then building the story around that or the world around that. You've got to decide what you want to prioritize with that. If the story, if you're going halfway through the story and realize that this would be better if they had a river, then it's okay to go back and put a river in, but you do have to be consistent and make sure that you go back and write the river from the beginning. So it doesn't have to be huge and set all in stone before you start writing the story.
But you got to keep in mind too, and Wes and I are both writing series. When you write a series, if the river wasn't there in first book, you can't put it there in the second book because your readers will call you on it every time. So you're going to have to figure out how to put a river in a different spot that they've never been to and travel to get there. So when you start to build that first book, don't rush to, oh, I gotta get it published. If you think there's another book, go on and start the next book. Let it kind of take you That way you see if you built everything right in the first book. Kind of gives you a chance to explore the next and make sure you kind of got it right. Another tip I would say, and you'll see this in very old books, but how many old fantasy books, if you opened up and the inside front cover is a map.
The map.
The map.
The map is almost a cliche.
It doesn't have to be, you know, anything fancy, but if you start building a city, a town, an area, a country, a world, maybe sketch out, okay, if I say the store's here and the restaurant's here, how long does it take to get between the two? Because it might make a difference of two characters running into each other or they missed each other because one had to come too far. You have to kind of think about that stuff, but it doesn't have to be when you first start. It just has to be by the time you're finished, you need to go back and look for those things. You may have to make some tweaks.
And alternately, if you want a river to show up where you didn't have one before, you could write the event where the river shows up. And that's its own plot point right there.
The dam could break and there
right.
you go.
Yeah.
One of the other things to address when you're making your world and making your story is figuring out why the story is happening now in the course of the world and what's going to be happening next in the world because of the story. And that will help you consider what elements in the world that you've got to have and got to prioritize and got to make sure that the readers understand. That's one of the other things in fantasy and science fiction especially. Since they are further away from the world that we know, they're going to require often more explanation to the reader about what they are and how they got that way. If there's a tribe of lizardmen, you're going to have some explanation for what the lizardmen are and how long they've been there and what their culture is.
And it usually, you refer to kind of the why. The why is what every book starts with. It's why now? You're building this world, it's coming along, just think about everyday life in your own city. What one event is a catalyst for why your character suddenly had something happen? What started that story that took them on that path? That's that core event that kicks off the story and makes it that one day different from everything else and changes their lives. Most books usually start them out pretty much in the beginning, but you gotta have the why. That's gotta be told early on, and it's gotta be believable, even if it's, you know, if you're writing everyday life now, it's still what's the difference today? I was in a car wreck, and that's what started the world change. You know, it changes everything, but you gotta make it believable and start it early.
And that can be the point where you start building the world out from this event. Other examples that I wrote when I actually made preparation for this panel tonight. A starship tech discovering something about his mission that puts him in danger with his superiors. He found something. That's what changed. Village baker looking to rescue his child from lizardmen barbarians and no one will help. That's the thing that changed. And someone gets the bright idea to steal a great treasure and upend an empire. And then having the idea of getting things started on that is the thing that changed. And from there, you build the world around it. What is the starship? Who is the tech? Why is this thing he discovered trouble? What is the relation to the village and where the lizardmen are? And what's the treasure? And how did it come to be? And what's the empire? And why does someone want to upend it? So from these events that Pat was talking about, you build outward from there and make the world fit this story that you want.
So talk a bit about characters, because there's primary characters in your story, and then there's the sideline characters, as I like to call them,
Right.
that make appearances. All characters need a purpose. It's harder when you're building a series because sometimes you might want to introduce a character in this book and he doesn't appear again until this book, because you're building something that 4 books from now he's going to play a major role. A lot of people don't understand him in that first book and they'll go, take him out. Well, you know there's a goal, so you got to make him believable enough in the first instance that he fits, but he's still a sub-character. But then you got to also develop your primary characters.
Well, what you're talking about with sub-characters fits in with what I call the active world. Everyone in the world is not part of the story, and if they are, they might just be a sub-character for it. There own life, like everyone else's in this world, is complicated in its own particular way. They've got their own priorities for what they want in life. They've got their own troubles. And by remembering that, even if it doesn't come up in your narration, that makes your world feel real and active. That this village baker encounters someone who's just waves at them in passing and has a scowl on their face. Well, they have a scowl on their face for reasons that really have nothing to do with the story, but it's one more thing that makes the world more believable. You encounter people probably every day who are in a bad mood for some reason that has nothing to do with you, and you'll never know why they were in a bad mood.
Excuse me, you say sub-character, you mean like a minor character?
Yeah, minor
Yes,
characters.
minor character.
What else to remember here? We
How
talked
do you
about
make them believable? I mean, making your characters believable.
the little scowls that they have, the mannerisms that they have, tics that they have, manners of speaking that they have, but it still also has to be consistent with the culture that you set up. If you're setting something in an Irish town and someone's in a bad mood and starts cursing in Arabic, that probably is inconsistent with the world that you set up.
In characters, primary characters, you don't have to give them tons of description. You don't have to divide, if you don't want to go, he's got on a green shirt and purple pants and a green hat and purple, if you don't want to go into that, that's fine, but there has to be enough description. Blue eyes, brown hair, that soft curl on her shoulder, something that makes the reader accept who they are, even if you allow them to create the rest of their vision for that person. There's got to be enough of a characteristic that should brown curly hair, and then you play that into different things. It makes it more intimate. It makes it more believable to you. You grasp it, you feel it, you kind of build your thought around that character. That's going to help you carry that character through the story more. If you just kind of say, her name is Jane, they've got no buy-in.
Except that they know that she comes from a place where Jane is either a common name or maybe a very unusual name.
Yeah.
It can be part of your setting and world building as well. What kind of names are the common ones that fit? If you have a village where everyone has some sort of a Celtic name, and then you also have someone who was born and raised there and their name is Baltaraz, then that's going to stand out as just weird. And that takes the weird things like that, take the reader out of the story, and that doesn't serve anybody well. And we're talking about culture. One of the things I wanted to bring up also when you're doing that, some people have worlds in their story that touch on a lot of different cultures, be they made up or be they real. One fallacy that writers have fallen into too many times is making one-note, monolithic kind of cultures, where these people over here are supposed to represent something, like the hill people represent the people who are living in perfect harmony with nature and everyone gets along. Well, that doesn't happen. Cultures aren't like that. There's always misfits, there's always contrarians and rebels, and making an entire culture a symbol for one sort of idea or thing, it stretches the disbelief way too much.
There has to be a fallacy. No culture, no person is perfect. Even Superman has a weakness. And without those weaknesses, not only are your characters not believable, but they also lose the ability for you to use them in an interesting way because they're just too perfect.
You said Superman a couple of times. That was one of the editorial issues about Superman in the late 60s. The editorial board were saying, I forgot the quote, or forgot the person who made the quote, who basically said, it's hard to write stories for a character who can destroy entire civilizations by listening hard.
Yeah.
And that was the problem they had with Superman, which they fixed up.
Well, that's why they relaunched him.
Right.
Because he was too powerful.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that believability includes their fallacies. And you can use those fallacies and weaknesses to bring humor into a story, to bring fear into a story, to make people nervous. You can use them in all kinds of ways, but then they help to bring your story along because now you want to know when that weakness is going to pop back up at the most inopportune time. And they will need to know it's going to happen. You know it's going to happen. Now they're waiting to see what that happening is. How did you get them to there? Talk a little bit more about the environment, though, the culture, because we haven't kind of
Right.
really explained that well.
Well, and I was made a section of things to avoid, and tropes and cliches, including environment, are one of the things that get overlooked a lot. They're, let me back up a little bit on tropes and cliches in general. Every genre has their tropes and their cliches, and there's some that people love, and some people will never get tired of them. The orphans with grand destinies, dark lords bent on ruling the world or destroying it. Prophecies, zombies, post-apocalyptic wandering warriors, tough as nails, space marines with a hidden heart of gold, or one of my favorites, the lost civilization whose knowledge far exceeds ours today. Those get overplayed, and they come and go. There's trends in literature like there are in everything else, but if there's ways to take one of these tropes and turn it on its ear and make it different and interesting, that is a very, very good thing to go and do. Which leads me to this book, The Tough Guide to Fantasyland. It is essentially a travelogue of fantasy fiction tropes and cliches written from the perspective of you, the tourist, being the reader of the book, and the things that you experience in there.
Isn't that Hell's Moving Castle? Isn't that the same author?
Diana Wynne Jones.
Yeah, she wrote Hell's Moving Castle.
Yeah, she's written a lot of fantasy, and the story behind the book is that she was laid up for a couple of months, and she and her husband and friend were talking about cliches, and they started developing this. And it's got things that talked about the lost civilization. It's all set up as entries of things that you might encounter during your tour, reading the trilogy of the fantasy book. In this case, this one is ancient engineering projects. They tend to litter the landscape in some parts of the continent. Most of them are quite mysterious, and all of them are made of some substance not known to present inhabitants. It is unknown quite what challenge caused earlier people to make things that were so very large. Most of them are of no use to anyone. It's very tongue-in-cheek. And the one patent I discussed a while back was touches on these tropes and on the environment in general, and it's the entry on insects in fantasy world. Insects, it says, are almost non-existent, possibly as a result of a wizard's war. Parasitic insects such as lice and bedbugs have mostly been stamped out, although fleas are still popular, and only hovels occasionally manifest houseflies. Small numbers of bees must exist, since honey is served by friendly wizards. So must silkworms, because many people wear silken garments. Otherwise, almost the only recorded insects are the mosquitoes that all tourists complain of in the marshes, usually in stinging clouds. So if you have a source like this, which I highly recommend if you're touching on fantasy in any way, I used that very entry when I was writing Artifice Conspiracy. And there is a scene where the two main characters are sneaking through a city trying to evade the guards. And they're going through back alleys through where inns and taverns and so forth are, which is where they dump their garbage. Garbage attracts rats and insects and so forth. And in this scene, they ducked behind another pile of trash and waited. The steps came closer, 2 or 3 people walking at a steady pace. Harlow made the mistake of putting his hand on the ground next to the trash. He had to bite his lip to keep from shouting when he felt some insects begin crawling over his hand. Closing his eyes tight, he shook them off as quietly as he could. So that scene, it builds the tension of the scene. It acknowledges something that's often overlooked in most fantasies and science fiction books. And what happens next, whether he's quiet enough or not, whether the guards find them, I'm not going to tell you this. It's available now. Go get it.
So mean, isn't he?
My book and hers.
Yes. So talk about, again, about the environment. So
Right.
environment can be all kinds of things. And you have to set the rules of that environment. Just remember, document your rules as you go along. Make some notes on these things. What kind of notes did you make?
On the world itself, on the physical geography of the world, I touched on it a little bit earlier, but you'll want the biomes, swamps and mountains and plains and hills and jungles to all make sense in how they fit together if you're writing any sort of story that's taking place in a world that's familiar to the reader. If you want, however, to have a swamp right next to a desert, that can be done, especially if you're writing a fantasy or a very peculiar science fiction story, but that again, you're going to have to explain it to the reader, come up with some reason, or at least have the characters acknowledge that this shouldn't exist and at some point, you'll still have to explain why it does, and it needs to be very, very interesting. But you can go off the deep end like that, so long as you maintain some sort of reason for why it is, some sort of interesting reason for why it is, and explain it to the reader in a way that isn't boring to them.
Such as the blasted world of Mungo.
Exactly. That's the perfect example from Flash Gordon. I nearly said Buck Rogers, that would have been very embarrassing. For Flash Gordon, it has separate areas that shouldn't coexist right next to each other, but they do. But there's a reason for it, and it makes the story more interesting because of it.
Well, Flash Gordon's another great example of every time they go to a different spot, it's a completely different world, an environment, from clothing to creatures to how much water is there, or their challenges, their belief systems. So he got to go play in a whole lot of different things as he wrote the story, but you've got to create each one of those and make them very distinct and very believable, and you got to explain the weirdities.
And that's one of the other things to remember. If you have weirdities in your world, if you have megatech of some kind, or if you have magic of some kind, or anything else that's just not in our real world, you have to develop that and make it consistent. And you have to consider the effect that all that has on the wider world. If there's magic where anyone can cast a powerful spell, that's going to affect the cultures of the world. If magic is really, really rare and only a couple of people can do it really well, that's also going to affect the world because those people are probably going to be in positions of power and influence. If you have cloning technology, that's going to affect how things work in the world, and that has to be considered in your story that is in that setting where there is cloning. You can't have this weird stuff and not acknowledge what it's going to do to the characters in your story.
And cloning should always come with a limitation. Santa Claus 2 probably is probably my favorite cloning. You know, the clone Santa Claus. Have a limitation. He's a little plastic looking and he's got a whole different agenda. So sometimes the cloning process, things go wrong. That's where you can build that whole twist to your story and make it go off. It could be a funnier clone. It could be a less, a very violent clone. It could be a very dark clone. You use those new characters as twists to play on. Then you got to have the environment. What happened to them and kind of what's their goal? Where are they going to go and how they affect everything?
And another point I want to touch on that's kind of related to that and the weirdity of the world is when you develop a good, strong, vibrant, active world that drives the story in its own way more so than just as a background setting for things. That is great. And that's when you've taken the world and the setting beyond just that to become a character in its own right. That's what some of these other books are here for. The Moors in Wuthering Heights are pretty much their own character. They drive the story. Without the Moors, there wouldn't be this story. It wouldn't feel the same. They're their own story. They're their own character. The Dust Bowl in Grapes of Wrath, that's its own character. It does its own thing. It drives the story. It affects the story. Middle Earth is its own character, and kind of an example of starting more from something besides character, because Tolkien developed the Elvish language and then decided to write a setting and a story for someplace to use it. And another one I pulled from fantasy is the Mistborn series from Brandon Sanderson. It's set in a world where a disaster happened millennia back. The leaves are brown, the sky is red, and volcanoes are constantly spewing ash over everything. That drives everything about the story, along with the magic system that he developed and kept consistent throughout the entire thing.
And these are all great books available at your local library. If you don't want to go to the bookstore and buy them, check them out, read them, enjoy them, share them.
And
Really, really good.
And there's one more character, not so much from books, it's been on a TV show for a long time, that this one is another character in its own right. That's the TARDIS from Doctor who is absolutely a character in its own right. So if you're able to get a setting going that becomes its own world, that becomes its own character, you've done a really, really good job.
Think about Alice in Wonderland. The characters are not all people. The caterpillar is and the Cheshire Cat are as well known as Alice and as well loved as Alice. So developing whatever is the encounter and that personality, that builds your character. And that's another person you have to play with as you develop your stories.
The only other thing I want to bring up as a thing, as a thing to avoid, I'm not going to say probably to avoid, as a thing to avoid, is when you're describing the parts of your world that you love so much, that you're excited about. And if you're excited about your setting, that's good. If you're excited about the world, that's a good sign, because if you're not excited about it, the reader's probably not going to be very excited about it either.
Right.
But because you're excited about it, in the story, you may find it hard to fight the temptation to describe things in great length and detail. These info dumps are blocks of text. They're paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, sometimes page after page after page of what the world, this part of the world is like this because of this happened, and they dress like this, and that's important because of this other thing. Those are the sections that readers tend to at best skim, and at worst just skip entirely and move on to where dialogue and action is happening.
Yeah.
So loving your wonderful world that you have created for your story is very, very good, but you've got to work it into the story in ways that don't drive the reader to skip that section.
Oh, yes. I have to read how pretty the green tree is with the brown bark, and it's so rough, and the sun. I'm done. I'm going to skim it. And that's going to hurt your reviews. And as a writer, it's about reviews. It's about your readers falling in love with your story, and your readers being willing to get online and go, I love this story and it was awesome and you should read it. Because as a writer, you need that in order to sell your books. Yes?
Jean M. All is really bad for that.
Do what?
With the Clan of the Cave Bear series.
Mhm.
Yeah.
She got great world, great characters, loved the books, but there were pages where I would
Just skip.
Just skip.
because she'd spend 5 pages on the north.
Uh-huh.
I just couldn't do it.
And you know what? If you really want to kind of do some of that, I always say, if you don't really like that, go put it on your website. You want to learn about this world? Go to my website and read the story about this. Go read this article I wrote on this. Go put it on your website. Send your readers to your website. Well, it's good for your traffic. It's also good for your readers that really like the detail. But
It
for
gets
those
it out
that
of your
don't,
system.
keeps them moving.
And then later you make a tech manual.
Yeah, there you go. Make a tag manual.
Jean Hall was a best-selling author for a long time, so somebody did like that.
Some people do.
Some people did, yeah.
Some people
So,
love it. I will tell you that, yes, I've read Twilight, and I was not a vampire book, and someone made me read a vampire book, and I read it and loved it, and now I write it. But it had a lot of descriptive, and I just can't do it. I'm not the type of person that likes it, so I'm going to be a skimmer. I'm looking for action.
But not all readers would.
But not all readers are like that. Some love it. So that's going to give you that mixed review. But if you're worried that your story is too bogged down, and if your beta reader reads it and says, it's really bogged down, strip some out, put it on a website, make a reference manual that describes your world. Maybe you can get somebody to draw cool pictures about that world, and you can have a whole nother book with pictures and descriptions in the book.
I feel like publishers must be telling authors who write in series to do an info dump on the previous books because they see that often.
Like keep bringing, keep going, I'm Stephanie Plum, and I'm this, and this is where I got started.
Perfect example.
Yes.
Mhm.
The reason they do that a lot, they start those books out with kind of who I am again and kind of make that statement early on in the book, is because they want the readers to feel like they can read this book and they didn't have to read the
Right,
last
not
book.
if they don't have to read the entire series, but meanwhile, for people who did, it's incredibly boring.
It is, and I usually skip right past the 3 paragraphs. In Stephanie's book, every time it's like 3 paragraphs, and skip right
I've seen
over
it
them.
be pages and pages, and it's
Mhm.
awful.
But on the other hand, it's a series, so even though you can pick that series up and read from anywhere, at some point they're going back and referring to grandma burning down the funeral home. And if you didn't read that story, you missed the comedy that went with it. You're going to keep going, I got to go back. So I tend to be the person that goes, I'm going to read a series, where's book 1?
Exactly, because it's very
I do as
disconcerting
well.
to pick up a book that you don't realize is book 3 out of a series, and the first 3 or 4 chapters are all recapping and wrapping up, tying up loose ends from the book before, that without any context or reference to what happened in the prior books and why this is going on.
And that you do find that a lot from some of the big houses, especially in certain types of series, because that's their formula. if you're going to a big house, you gotta follow their, whatever formula they want, unless you are, you know, Patterson or somebody like that who's just selling, it doesn't matter, you can do what he wants. That's right, make your own formula. That's why this book, the best review I've ever had on this book probably, is also the most probably difficult for some people to understand. But he's like, it starts out a little slow, but he goes, by the time I hit chapter 15, he goes, I got why she did it, because I have to develop multiple characters, and I gotta like introduce each one, so they're all in different different chapters, and then they all collide. So it's building their thought, their world, just giving you a taste of who they are. Now make them collide, and now we take off, and there's 15 books. So you gotta sometimes build that world, but I don't do that. I don't go back and go, now I may refer back to something briefly with a sentence or two to some event in a previous book, but I don't do the Stephanie Plum, who I am again. Yeah, it's tough. Any more questions? Well, we want to thank you guys for coming tonight, and again, please review books for every author that you read. Do them a favor. Online reviews make their books sell. Without those, nobody shows them. Sign up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out our Dark Oak Press website. We have a lot of writing tips there, articles on writing. Our catalog has great little things where you can click on the picture and there's a little link and you can read a little excerpt from the book and see what you think about them. And the channel has a lot of other things as well, from writing to historical haunts to author interviews and more content coming. So please check us out. Thanks a lot for coming.